My grandfather was born in Mexico City when it was still called the Federal District, of course. But a few days after he was born, he and his whole family were taken to the state of Aguascalientes. He didn't get to know the country's capital until later, when he had to come to work for a company that had offices on Eje Central, not far from the historic center. He'd arrived quite early, finished what he had to do, and since he still had a few hours free that afternoon, he decided to walk around downtown. He always said that the city impressed him. The noise, the crowds, the old buildings next to the new ones. Everything in this city made him feel small, and at the same time as if he were visiting a place that somehow also belonged to him. As I told you, he was born here, but his parents took him to Aguascalientes when he was just a baby, and he didn't return until then. He said that walking through those streets he felt a strange nostalgia, the nostalgia for a life he hadn't lived. That day he went into a simple restaurant to eat. He ordered a main course and a beer, then another, and then another. He never liked alcohol, but those three of them made him quite happy. In a good way. Well, happy and a little brave, because even though he was terrified of heights, the idea of going up the Torre Latinoamericana El Mirador, that imposing tower visible from much of the city, got stuck in his head. Back then, it must have been even more impressive because it wasn't full of skyscrapers like it is now. He said his legs were trembling when he got on the elevator, and even more so when he stepped out onto the observation deck. But when he looked out, when he saw that immense city gradually lighting up as darkness fell, he felt the fear was worth it. He looked at everything very carefully, as if he wanted to etch it into his memory forever. The cars moving like ants of light on Alameda Avenue with its dark trees, the impressive Palace of Fine Arts with its golden dome that shone even though night was falling. He had a small pair of binoculars that he always carried when he traveled, a pair of long-range binoculars. He hung them around his neck and began to look more closely. He saw people entering and leaving the subway. He saw the vendors packing up their stalls. He saw how life went on, even though it was already night. And in the midst of that nostalgia, he saw something he couldn't explain. Above the Palace of Fine Arts, something was moving. At first he thought it was a shadow, an illusion. But when he focused the binoculars, he saw it more clearly. A tall, very tall black figure, about 2.5 meters high, stood right at the very top of the roof. He said it reminded him of a gargoyle, like the ones he'd seen in photographs of buildings in France, but with its wings outstretched. At first, he thought it was a snag tarp or something, some strange object. But then the figure moved, flexed its legs as if adjusting itself, and then spread its wings even wider. They were enormous. My grandfather froze, but he couldn't stop staring, and this thing just stared down at the cars, at the people, as if observing them. Suddenly, as if it had sensed his gaze, this thing raised its head and looked directly at him, at my grandfather. My grandfather always said he didn't know what he felt at that moment. It wasn't exactly fear, but a void in his stomach, a premonition. The creature stared at him for a few seconds that seemed like an eternity, and then with a leap, it spread its wings and flew toward the Alameda. It skimmed the treetops until it disappeared into the darkness. In the distance, my grandfather abruptly took off his binoculars from the lookout point, his heart racing. He didn't tell anyone. No one else seemed to have noticed. He walked back to the hotel. He tried to convince himself it had been his imagination, that perhaps it had only been a huge bird that fear and darkness had made him mistake. The next morning he got up very early, took a taxi to the bus station, boarded his bus, and began his journey back to Aguascalientes. It was the morning of September 19th, 1985. That same day, barely an hour later, at 7:19 a.m., an earthquake devastated Mexico City. My grandfather noticed some movement and very frightened people at the Hidalgo bus station during a break. Later, he saw the news, and he remained silent, as if he couldn't believe it. That enormous tragedy had almost happened to him. He always thought that one thing had no relation to the other. On the one hand, what he had seen at the lookout point was one of the many strange things that could inhabit the city. On the other hand, the earthquake was a natural phenomenon, something no one could have predicted. But years later, one night when he was watching television, a movie came on, The Messenger of Darkness, Modman Prophecies. The exact translation of the original title would be The Mothman Prophecies. At first, it caught his attention, but he thought it was a made-up story. When it ended, he learned that it was based on real events in a town in the United States where people claimed to have seen a similar being, a winged creature that appeared before great tragedies. From then on, my grandfather began to think that what he saw that night wasn't a gargoyle or a strange bird, but the Mothman. Last year, when I moved to Mexico City, the only thing my grandfather said to me as I left was, "If you ever see him again, grab your things and go right back to Aguascalientes." He was very serious, and even though he says he's over it, I know that memory still scares him. My grandfather only told me once how his father disappeared. It was a story my mother had once told in very broad strokes, but she said it wasn't her place to tell me. It was a quiet afternoon after lunch. We were in the patio. He stood watching the chickens pecking at the damp ground, and then spoke to me softly, as if someone else could still hear him. He told me, "I'll tell you once, but you can't ask me again afterward." He said that he and his family lived in a small town in Michoacan, in a little house on the hill. There they took care of their animals and planted what they needed: corn, beans, squash. Life was simple, and they had enough, and that was enough for some of their neighbors to harbor something ugly inside them. My grandfather used to say that the envy of a bad person doesn't make a sound at first, but it works tirelessly. It works and works and works. Few things in life are as dangerous as envy that festers, like the people who harbor it, like bad people. Higher up from where they lived, almost where the thickest woods began, lived 3 women, a woman and her 2 daughters. No one needed to call them bad. People already knew they were bad. At night, smoke would rise from their house when there was no fire left in any of the others. Sometimes at dawn, strange things would appear on the road that passed by their house, pebbles arranged in odd shapes and little red threads tangled around a branch, a dead bird with its legs tied. My grandfather and his brother, who were just children then, were very afraid of them. One of the daughters would always greet them with a strange smile and say, "Hey kids, say hi to your dad for me." They never carried the message. They knew, even though they were little, that it wasn't well wishes, that he didn't mean well. My grandfather's father, as he told me, was very serious and only had eyes for his wife. If they crossed paths with those women on the road, he would look at the ground or the sky, but not at them. Once, the older woman spoke to him from afar, and he simply kept walking straight ahead as if he hadn't heard her. One day, my grandfather's mother had to go down to the village to take care of a sick aunt, a very old aunt who would take to her bed every so often, and everyone thought she was going to die. But she didn't. She would just keep going and going. But this was another one of those times when she suddenly couldn't get up. While they were at their aunt's house, their mother cooked them lunch, and before it got dark, she told the children to take a plate up to their house and give it to their father. The 2 of them went happily because they always liked to be helpful. There goes my grandfather with his little brother, quite short for his age, but always close by his side. As they were approaching their house, they saw 2 of the women hurrying out as if they had been startled to see them. The 2 brothers looked at each other and quickened their pace. Inside their house, they found their father sitting on the bench staring blankly into space. His mouth was open and his eyes weren't blinking. The other woman, one of the daughters, the one who always greeted him, was standing next to him, feeding him a broth that smelled of meat and herbs. "Wait," she told them, "I'm almost finished." My grandfather recounted that the laughter that escaped that woman was what made their courage overcome their fear. They pounced on her and dragged her out. The woman was laughing softly as if nothing had happened. My grandfather still remembered the smell. Smoke. Epazote. Something very sweet. The little brother stayed with his father, talking to him, trying to get him to react, and my grandfather ran down the hill to find his mother at his aunt's house. Amidst the smell of medicine and the murmur of the neighbors, he managed to tell them what had happened when he caught his breath. His aunt took his mother's arm and begged her not to get involved with those women, that nothing good would come of it. Even so, the 2 of them went upstairs. Yes, even the sick aunt with him in tow. The other neighbors were afraid to go. They found his father with a very high fever. He was burning up, not eating, unresponsive. There was no doctor in the village. So on the 3rd day, when things were still the same and there was no improvement, the mother decided to go and find one on the morning bus. My grandfather insisted on walking him to the bus stop and then ran back home. But when he arrived, his little brother was crying. He told him that his father had gotten up and left without saying a word, without saying anything to him. As if he couldn't hear him, his eyes rolled back. He said he tried to stop him, but he couldn't. He clung to his leg, but it wasn't enough. "Where did he go?" my grandfather asked, and his little brother pointed up the hill toward the house of the three women. My grandfather ran the silent kind of running you do when you can barely feel your body anymore, and he saw his father in the distance, still walking up the sidewalk as if someone were calling him straight ahead without looking to either side. He managed to see him reach that house in the distance, and someone opened the door for him and then closed it behind him, but he didn't see who. It was as if the door had opened by itself. My grandfather arrived breaths too late. He knocked on the door with his fist, then with both hands, then he kicked it. He shouted, and nothing. His little brother had gone down to the village to warn them. Dot, there in front of the house, was still... My grandfather was there when my aunt arrived, sick and all, along with two policemen with machetes and pistols. They pushed open the door and searched the house, the room, the kitchen, the loft. They opened a trunk, struck the floor with the edge of the machete, reached behind the stove, and there was no one there. My grandfather looked at the stove. There were warm embers, an overturned plate with remnants of broth. The bedsheet was wrinkled as if someone had just sat down on it. Hours later in the afternoon, when my mother finally returned with the doctor, my grandfather went out to meet her on the road. She didn't know what words to use to tell him what had happened, and the four of them went up to that house on the hill. His mother didn't wait for them. She ran to the door, pushed it open, and stood still inside. The doctor peeked out from behind her. His aunt put her hand to her mouth. My grandfather went back inside. The house was empty, but not empty like before, like when someone goes out. Not empty like in the morning. It was empty in a different way. Inside there was dirt, dried mud in the corners, cobwebs on the frames, the same walls, but as if they'd been abandoned for a long time. There was no hearth, no bed. Even the floorboards creaked differently. The wind rustled a leaf across the ground, and my grandfather said the worst part wasn't not finding his father, but realizing there was nowhere to look for him, as if, in an instant, not only those women had been erased, but their entire existence. They searched for days on end among ravines and paths. The police went from promising to find him to simply shrugging their shoulders when my grandfather's mother went to ask. Some neighbors swore they'd seen shadows in the woods. Others preferred to remain silent. My grandfather's mother then put on her black shawl, one she never took off again, and she never climbed back up to that house on the hill. When my grandfather finished telling me, he fell silent. He told me that they never saw her father or the three women again, that if you asked about the house upstairs, they would say yes, it was still there, but nobody could pinpoint exactly where it was. They were forgetting as the years passed. "They took my father away with a bowl of soup," he said finally, like someone repeating something they don't understand. And then he just asked me to pour him another cup of coffee without giving me time to ask anything. I didn't want to ask anything else either. He never brought it up again. And I know this is a horror story, and at the same time, very sad. But that afternoon when he told it to me is one of the most vivid memories I have of my grandfather. May he rest in peace. When he was young, my grandfather worked for a while as a night watchman at the cemetery in his town. It was a job he liked to boast about, and in fact, he only mentioned it occasionally, as if it were something he preferred to leave buried, just like the deceased there. The cemetery was on the outskirts of town, where the last street of houses ended and the scrubland in silence began. It was a simple place, some earthen graves with wooden crosses, others with quarry stone tombstones and iron crosses, plastic flowers that had almost lost their color. During the day, people came and went, but at night when they closed the doors, the silence felt different, deafening like the silences of the Pantheon. He said he was hired mostly for peak seasons because it was never a formal job. He worked more around the Day of the Dead, or around that time of year, or when there were recent burials and people were afraid someone might steal the offerings, or even open a grave to take what had been buried with the deceased. Those were very hard times, and some people weren't afraid to do things like that. My grandfather had an iron cot in the little watchman's hut, right next to the entrance. They gave him a kerosene lamp, a machete, and a whistle. That was all. And nothing out of the ordinary ever happened until one rainy night. He said he was lying down, listening to the rain hitting the roof, when he heard footsteps, very clear footsteps. At first he thought it was his imagination, but there they were, footsteps on the wet gravel, slow, dragging. Then he heard them again, closer. He got up, grabbed his lamp, and went outside. In the rain, he saw the silhouette of a man. He was hunched over, carrying a sack on his back. The sack shifted slightly, as if it contained something restless. My grandfather thought it might be a thief, someone who had broken in to steal flowers or some offering. He shouted at him, but the man kept walking straight ahead as if he hadn't heard him. Then he followed him among the crosses and gravestones. The man came to an open, freshly dug grave, and then my grandfather saw clearly that what he was carrying in the sack wasn't flowers. It was a body. A human-sized body, limp, buckling with every movement. The man lowered it from his shoulder and effortlessly placed it in the grave. Then he began to cover it with earth, as if he had been waiting for that moment. My grandfather felt a chill. He was about to take a step forward, but at that instant the man raised his head, and although the lamp barely illuminated the area, he swore that what he saw before him was not an ordinary face. It was pale, without an expression, like a mask of what had once been human. He ran. He didn't know if he'd left the lamp behind or if he was still holding it. He just ran. He went all the way to the village to find a policeman. He woke him up, and they went back together, ready to search again, this time with the policeman's gun and a brighter flashlight. They entered the cemetery and went straight to the grave. The earth was undisturbed even, covered only by rain. There were no signs that anyone had touched it, that what my grandfather clearly saw had just happened. They searched around, looked for footprints, but there was nothing, only the dripping water and the mud already forming in the passageways. The policeman, somewhat angry, told him that he must have fallen asleep, that he had dreamed it, but my grandfather never believed it was a dream. He said he still remembered the sound of the body falling into the pit. That night he never went back to bed. He sat there, machete in hand, until dawn. Shortly afterward, he quit that job. He never told them the reason why. He was ashamed to admit it, but it was because of what happened that night, because of that vision of a man carrying a body in the rain. When he told the story, he always fell silent at the end, as if waiting for someone to ask him something, but no one ever did. Because if what he saw wasn't a thief or a living person, then the only thing left to think was that he had seen someone who no longer belonged to this world. The eternal, ghostly repetition of a terrible event. My grandmother used to tell me that when she was young, she lived for a while with one of her aunts in an adobe house in the mountains. It was a humble but large place, surrounded by trees and fields. She had chickens, a donkey, and a small vegetable garden. And in the middle of the yard, almost in line with the house and the small bathroom with its tin roof, was a well. That well served all purposes, filling jugs with water, washing clothes, even drawing water to bathe the animals. But it caused my grandmother a feeling of unease that she couldn't explain. She said that this well seemed too deep, too dark, as if it had no bottom. Even when the sun was at its zenith, one would peer over and barely see a black reflection, as if there were no water below, only emptiness, and she never dared to pass by it at night. If for some reason she had to go to the bathroom in the early morning, she would run with her head held high without turning around, feeling the open wound. That's why she always preferred to endure it. The first time she heard it was on a new moon night when the courtyard was completely dark. She had stayed awake reading by an oil lamp. Around midnight she heard her name. At first she thought it had been a dream, a trick of tiredness, but the voice returned clearer. "Julia," it said. At that moment her skin turned pale. She recognized that voice. It was the voice of her mother who had died 5 years before. Her heart pounded in her chest. She got up slowly and went to the window. Outside, nothing moved, not even the trees. And then she heard it again, firmer, closer. "Come out, daughter, come with me." There was no doubt it was her mother's voice, the same intonation, the same way of calling her. That night she didn't dare look. She closed her eyes and prayed until dawn. But from then on, every night, at the same time, the voice returned, always coming from the well, always with the same call. "Julia, daughter, come with me." Weeks passed, and fear mingled with curiosity, with an inexplicable need, until one day she couldn't bear it any longer. One day she opened the window and saw a woman sitting on the edge of the well, her back to her. She was wearing the same dress her mother had worn in life, the only one she remembered clearly. Also the dress they buried her in, blue with white flowers, only now it was soaked, clinging to her body as if she'd just been pulled from the water. She wasn't moving. She didn't even seem to be breathing, but her voice continued as if it weren't coming from her. "Come with me. Come. Come with me. Accompany me." My grandmother slammed the curtain shut, made sure the bolt was securely in place on the door, ran to the bed, and covered her face with the blanket. She said that even the smell of dampness was brought into the room, as if someone had drawn water from the well and simply emptied it there. From then on, the voice was no longer heard only from inside the well. Every night it was heard outside. Every night it seemed to be closer. First in the yard around the well, then in the hallway, as if the woman had come out and was walking around the house. My grandmother learned never to answer, to close her eyes, to pretend to be asleep, even though she heard the call again and again, until one night she heard it right at the door. The voice no longer begged, it commanded. "Open up, daughter. Come with me. Open up." And then she heard the creaking of the lock, the soft taps of someone testing it, and in fear she screamed. She screamed like she never had before and woke her aunt. The older woman got up in a bad mood, thinking it was all nightmares, but when she went to the window and looked out, her anger vanished. She also made sure the door was locked. She took her niece to bed, laid her down, and covered her with a blanket, and then she lay down with her. They stayed together, trembling, all night. Sometime later, a long time later, her aunt confessed to my grandmother that she had seen something that night, something terrible. And not exactly the same thing as her, who on the edge of the yard managed to make out something impossible. A figure standing half hidden by the shadow, a rotting body covered in dirt, dressed in wet rags, and instead of a face, a nearly wet skull that turned to look at her just before running toward the well. The creature threw itself in as if the darkness had swallowed it whole. The next morning, a nephew went down with a rope and a bucket to check. He found nothing but water, no body, no clothing, nothing strange. But even so, my aunt had the well covered. She preferred to be without water rather than keep hearing that voice coming from it, rather than see the woman who came out of the well again, the one who wanted to take her niece away. Years passed. My grandmother grew up, got married, and left the village. Her aunt died and the land remained abandoned until a relative took advantage of it. Much later, when that relative died, his children wanted to put the land in their names, but they discovered that in the original will, my grandmother was the sole heir. Her aunt had left it to her, and that's how she returned. That's how we came to know that place. I remember very well the first time I went. The adobe house was still standing, although half the roof had already collapsed. The patio was covered in tall grass, and in the center, covered only by old planks, the well remained, open and in use. My father renovated the house, made it beautiful, and left the well there. My grandmother divided the farmland among the relatives who needed it most, those who had worked it for years. But that house, she left to me. And although she never spoke of what happened again, until her last days, she repeated the same warning to the whole family. "If ever after I die you hear me calling you from the well at night, it's not me. I swear it won't be me.